guys. So let's get started with society in the industrial age. This is going to be Unit 5, Topic 9. Make sure that you have your guided notes out and have those ready to go. So we're going to still continue to talk about the Industrial Revolution, the Industrial Age, but now we're going to start to talk about how that changed society. So your learning objective for this section is to explain how industrialization caused change in existing social hierarchies and standards of living. So we're going to talk about developing of new social classes, the middle class particularly. We'll talk about how women and children began to work in factories or began to, especially in working class families, held jobs to kind of supplement income. We'll talk about urbanization, how that changed society. So that's kind of the effort that we're going to get through today, is talking about how industrialization changed society. So let's get into that. So before the Industrial Revolution, European societies were, generally speaking, agrarian societies. They had a social structure that had a very clear hierarchy. You can see one example of those on the screen, right? The clergy, the church nobility, the church members, priests, etc. at the top, followed by the nobles, the wealthy, and then the peasants. Think of this example here as three estates, right? The three estates in the French society, where we had the first estate, which was the clergy, the church members, the second estate, which was the nobility, and then the commoners or the peasants, which was also known as the third estate. So that's kind of the example that we have from there. Let me kind of move myself out of the way just a bit so you can see the rest of the screen. But remember that the nobility kind of own most of the land. They hold lots of the political, economic power, and the clergy have a lot of influence, particularly in things like education and spiritual matters. And the vast majority of the population were poor, were peasants who work the land, live in rural areas. They're under the control of landlords, under control of the nobles. Urban populations in cities exist, but they're very small. There's usually craftsmen and small merchants and small professionals who kind of do some odd jobs and things like that. And the Industrial Revolution comes along and is going to completely alter that, right? Is going to cause significant economic and social changes that lead to the rise of what we call a bourgeoisie, which is the middle class, a new middle class of industrialists, of business owners. So not quite nobles, not quite that wealthy, but more wealthy than a peasant, than poor. So that's why we consider them the bourgeoisie. So this middle class, which we call it a middle class because it falls between the nobility and the peasants, right? It falls in the middle. This middle class kind of comes about and has significant social force due to their new wealth that's generated from industry, from manufacturing, from business, from finance. So these people, this bourgeoisie, are really instrumental in driving the industrial growth, investing in factories, innovating in production. They're not like the traditional aristocrats. Their status is not based on land ownership, but it's based on enterprise, on business, on capital. So that allows them to sort of challenge the existing social order and push for political reforms that are going to protect and enhance their interests. So let's take a look at some more of that as we go. So the industrial working class. So alongside the rise of the bourgeoisie, we have an industrial working class, otherwise known as a proletariat. Now, we've already talked about both of these in the last couple sections. We talked about the proletariat, we've talked about the bourgeoisie, but we want to get into how those emerge and change society. The proletariat, if we remember, is composed of people who sell their labor, are workers. They are the ones who operate machinery, they produce goods in factories. They kind of emerge from patterns of mass migration of former peasants and rural farm workers who move to urban centers, move to cities to seek employment in the industry. They are experiencing harsh conditions. They're experiencing long hours, low wages. They have little to no social protection. And this concentration of workers in those factories leads to the development of what is called class consciousness. Workers begin to organize themselves. They're very conscious of where they fall in society. They are very conscious with how society views them. And so they begin to organize themselves into unions and political movements and push for better working conditions, push for better wages, more rights in the workplace and outside of the workplace. So this working class, this industrial working class, brings to light some of the inequalities of the industrial age. So we want to make sure we understand where these people fit in. They are the ones who are facing the conditions, and they are the ones who then bring to light that inequality. They're doing all of this backbreaking, difficult work, but they're not being treated equally or being treated fairly for the work that they are doing. Okay. So moving on to the middle class. Okay, the middle class that comes about during the Industrial Revolution has a very different lifestyle, which sets it apart from the aristocracy and from the working class. Middle class families live usually in urban or suburban homes, very well appointed, well furnished homes. It reflects their economic stability, reflects their social aspirations, and this class puts a lot of emphasis on domestic comfort. right? Things like the refrigerator, etc., right? Those kinds of things, even though we didn't really have that, but that's kind of a comfort. So domestic comfort, they put their emphasis on kind of the nuclear family, husband, a wife, and 2 kids. That's what we would consider a nuclear family. And I'm saying family a little weird, sorry. But there's this clear division of gender roles as well. Men are the breadwinners. They're the ones who are out working. They are bringing home money. Their women, their wives are usually given the job of managing the household, cooking, cleaning, raising the kids. This is where that idea comes from in this period. The middle class has access to consumer goods like books, instruments, later on electrical appliances, which start to be invented and developed in this period. And those consumer goods symbolize their status and symbolize the comfort they're looking for. Now, the values of the middle class are, again, usually centered around respectability, around self-improvement, around social mobility, hard work, it being more prudent and not like spending wildly, but, moderately, because those are means to achieve personal success and to ultimately move yourself up in the social class. So there's a high value on education, not just as sort of an education, but as an end of itself. So not means to an end, but like an end. So there's this culture of literacy, cultural refinement, intellectual achievement. The middle class wants to sort of distinguish themselves from the working class people through their manners, their speech, the activities they do, the practices they do, the hobbies that they have, going to the theater, playing the piano, participating in charity events and things like that. They want to really differentiate themselves from the middle class, from the working class. So let's compare working class women to middle class women. So during the Industrial Revolution, working class women, they are a very crucial part of this industrial workforce. They take jobs in factories. They take jobs in mines under some very, very harsh conditions. They're employed in very large numbers in textile industries, which the textile industry, as we remember, is like the first to industrialize, and pottery, coal mines, things like that. But working class women get lower wages compared to their male coworkers. Still somewhat true today in some cases. They generally work in environments that are very hazardous to their health, very, very dangerous. But the necessity for women to work was really driven by the economic demand of supporting a family, right? A single income was usually not enough to survive in a new urban city. Now, compare that to middle-class women, right? They experience the Industrial Revolution very differently, right? They're working compatriots, they're working sisters, working in factories. And middle-class women generally center their lives around the home, center their lives around family, the ideas of a domestic life. And this is a cultural norm that women should be kind of pure, submissive to their husband, devoted to their family, devoted to homemaking. And they are expected to really oversee everything involving the home, right? Raising children, managing the household, maintaining the family's moral standard. And right, this is a division based on societal view and based on gender roles and economic status, right? There's this ability to remain out of the workforce. They don't have to work, these middle-class women. And if the woman does not have to work, this provides a sense of status for the family. Okay. Now, also in this period, we see child labor. Now, we've talked about child labor in some form in the industrial workforce earlier in this unit, but to sort of recap it here, child labor is a very common practice during the Industrial Revolution. Children as young as 5 years old were working in factories, mines, and mills, and just like their adult coworkers, they worked long hours, some children working up to 16 hours a day in very unsafe and unhealthy environments. And the reason why that so many children work was because families needed the income, right? They needed the money. And this, to some extent, still exists in some parts of the world, including the US today. Some kids do work because their families need money. They need the additional income. Now, children are generally seen as a cheap source of labor. They perform lots of different tasks that are usually dangerous and exhausting. They work on machinery, particularly fixing machinery as well, because their hands are smaller, so they can get into tighter spaces. They usually carry heavy loads. They clean and repair equipment. So you see here, this picture is of 4 child miners, right? They are kids who work in a mine in the late 1800s, right? They're not spared from very difficult jobs. You can see these kids, these 4 children, probably aged no more than 8 or 9, maybe, coming out of the coal mines from work, right? So working in very, very dangerous conditions. Now, we also want to talk about society's response to environmental impacts during the Industrial Revolution as well. So there's this huge demand for raw materials timber for construction and fuel. That leads to deforestation, which is still a concern in industrialized countries today. Forests are cleared out not only for wood, but to make way for farming, farm expansion, agricultural expansion to feed the growing population centers, for mining to extract minerals and coal. We see lots of air pollution and soot. The extensive use of coal in factories and homes releases large quantities of smoke, greenhouse gases, and things like that. So industrial cities become very notorious for their polluted and smoggy skies, which causes a lot of health problems for the people who live there. We also see examples of water pollution. Factories often kind of just getting rid of their untreated wastewater and toxic water directly into the river, directly into streams, which contaminates drinking water, destroys aquatic habitats and things like that. And then the use of heavy machinery in agriculture as well. We get chemical fertilizers and pesticides that begin to change how the soil works, or the composition of the soil, right? Impacts health, leading to the health of the soil as well, leading to erosion, contamination, things like that. And then cities grow very quickly, which results in overcrowding, overcrowded living conditions, inadequate sanitation, lots of waste and trash, which is, again, another environmental public health challenge. So this shift towards the use of fossil fuels and the rapid growth of industry changes the human relationship with the environment, and lays the foundation for a lot of the challenges that we see today, right? So global warming, greenhouse gases, things like that, that kind of gets its start here in the Industrial Revolution. Okay. Now, this image here is a painting of a place called Coalbrookdale, which was considered to be kind of the birthplace of one of the birthplaces of the Industrial Revolution. So I want you to think here, the image kind of suggests what the image suggests about the impact of coal during the Industrial Revolution, right? You see this landscape, which has this billowing smoke, a glowing fire of an industrial factory. This suggests to us that the extensive use of coal during the Industrial Revolution has a significant environmental impact, contributing to air pollution, which you can see by the smoke in the sky, altering the natural landscape. You know, it looks very dirty, dingy, unclean, soot everywhere. Everything looks kind of dingy and dirty, right? But then we also want to think of how did the use of coal as a primary energy source kind of contribute to the changes in labor during the Industrial Revolution. So the image shows figures engaging in labor near the factories, right? Indicating this shift from farming work or agrarian work to industrial labor, driven by the machinery. So here you kind of see those gentlemen here. You see people in the background, people off to the side here, right? So again, just a shift in the types of jobs and the concentration of workers in industrial areas. You can see more of a concentration of workers there in the back. So just keep those things in mind, how even looking at an image like this can help us answer some of those questions when we think about the time period that it fits in. Now, urbanization does also provide other sources of change. So in cities, larger cities, there's a sense of anonymity, right? Nobody really knows anybody else, right? Not like a small neighborhood where you pretty much know everybody. In a large city, anybody could be anybody. And so there's also population density. There's lots of poverty in these cities in this period. There's not really a very effective law enforcement. We start to see the beginnings of police forces and things like that. So we see pretty high crime rates, which, like theft, burglary, drunkenness, that are very common. And of course, along with that comes more serious crimes like assault and murder. But the anonymity that's offered by an urban environment makes it easier for criminals to kind of evade capture. So industrial cities like London, Manchester, New York were very, very significant, had very significant slums, right, which were known as rookeries or tenements. Slums, again, if we remember back to our vocabulary, slums were densely populated areas where poor population lived, right? The poor lived in the cities, right? So there's lots of narrow alleys, falling apart housing. There's a lack of amenities. So some of those conditions kind of undermine the public health, but also kind of give rise to the incidences of crime that people struggle to survive. So as a response, we start to see cities establish formal police forces, like I mentioned. So the London Metropolitan Police was established in 1829, tried to give some sort of organized and professional law enforcement to the region. In the later half of the 19th century, in the later half of the 1800s, you see social reform movements that sought to address some of these root causes of poverty and crime. So we start to see housing reforms, improved sanitation, better working conditions, things like that. The establishment of public parks, the establishment of libraries and educational programs and schools, all part of an effort to improve the living conditions in cities and kind of uplift the people who live in these urban centers, right? To sort of remedy the situation that we see with urbanization and crime. Now, if we recall from earlier in this unit as well, the tenement housing that developed as a result of urbanization during the Industrial Revolution, I want you to recall that. There's an example of one on the screen here. These tenements lack basic services, lack basic amenities. They don't generally have running water. They don't generally have sewage systems. So this contributes to a public health crisis. And this housing crisis is not merely a matter of shelter, but was kind of combined with the overall quality of life. So it affects physical and mental health of the urban population. In fact, one of the more kind of significant health crisis of the 19th century is an outbreak of cholera, which cholera is a disease that travels through water, causes severe diarrhea and dehydration. And those cholera outbreaks would kill thousands of people in cities like London or Hamburg in Germany, which kind of reveals the need for an improved urban sanitation, like we mentioned in the last slide. Right, those are significant changes that are needed in public health policies, the development of modern sewage systems, sewage treatment plants, things like that. And so again, some cities begin to experiment with public housing, which is a thing we still see today in cities, providing affordable sanitary housing options for the working class. And again, creation of public parks, public housing, public baths, public health clinics, things like that, kind of to aim at kind of helping improve the living conditions in industrial cities. So again, these are the key points that I'd like you to keep in mind out of 5.9. How does social structure shift from being rooted in land ownership in the pre-industrial Europe to being based on capital and enterprise and business? Keep in mind the new middle class, which consists of businessmen, professionals, middle-class women that are typically in charge of domestic duties. And then also keep in mind the industrial working class, consisting of the factory workers, the family members, women and children that participate in the workforce, things like that. But also keep in mind that women are paid lower wages as well. And then think about how industrialization brings lots of environmental impacts, poor air quality, polluted water, deforestation, and then couple that with some of the problems that exist because of urbanization. Remember that industrialization led directly to urbanization, and then urbanization also comes with its own problems as well. Higher crime rates, poor housing and sanitation conditions, and those are things that we all seek to, as we get into later units, that we'll see addressed more. So keep those ideas in mind as you review 5.9.